Welcome everybody to RACF the right way. For those who don't know me, I'm Altmark, IBM. I've been working at IBM for 40 years, and I've been doing RACF for probably 25 of those, 30 of those, I guess. So I got a little frustrated over the years, mostly because people say bad things about RACF. I don't like that. So I tried to figure out what was really wrong, and it turns out that people just are lazy. So, and that's in two forms. One side from the development side. People didn't like how RACF was working on their systems, and it created it introduced a lot of administrative overhead and confusion. Okay? And that's because as we deliver RACF out of the box, and if you do what we just tell you to do without thinking about it, that you end up with a RACF configuration that is designed to demonstrate what RACF can do. It is not designed to help. That configuration is not really designed to get you started, right? It kind of is designed to say, I drink all the Kool-Aid. Okay, I've got all of them. And we're going to see that in this, that the right way, which is my way, after consulting with absolutely nobody except me, but I've deployed it this way at clients, and they've been very happy with it. That would be the highest authority, right? What's that?
Nobody but me, that would be the highest authority.
Yes.
So I thought.
So I use the term suboptimal here. I'll just go ahead and say that it really sucks from my perspective. It's just all this extra work for no reason. But however, we do have the way out, and the way out says, the book says to customize according to your needs before you proceed. I don't know what more we can tell you. I mean, it's laid out right there. If you should adjust it the way you think it ought to be, but nobody knows how it ought to be, so they don't do anything. But what you end up with really are configurations that, first of all, you didn't invent. Ergo, you can't explain it when somebody, what are you doing? Okay? Now, who would you explain it to, first of all? Well, typically, if you got ZOS people in the house, they're asking questions. If you've got a competent auditor, they're asking questions. But I've yet to find ZVM people who actually invite competent auditors. Okay? They try to say, auditor shows up, there's a scurrying sound, you see the door closing, and ZVM has just hightailed it out of the room. So, but typically, you will fail an audit, but if you don't know why you're doing what you're doing. Because that's actually one of the things auditor looks for. Why are you doing this? I don't know. Oh, that's interesting. Minor non-conformance there. And it turns out that in the space where we're working with DIRMate, the DIRMate RACF connector, the decisions you make from a RACF configuration perspective affect DIRMate. Okay? Because we expect, when we've got the connector configured, that DIRMate, when I initialize the database, how do I keep a RACF database in sync with my needs? Well, that's what the DIRMate RACF connector is doing. But if it's doing something different than how you initialize your database, things are just getting worse and worse and worse over time. All right. So the default configurations, they do introduce a bunch of, I just say, unneeded complexity, and they don't really they don't follow what I believe to be modern security requirements. Okay, and I'm going to show you very explicitly some of those. Really cool. You want to know what RACF can do? There it is, laid out right there. Installed out of the box. Almost everything it's capable of doing. The only thing that it doesn't enable, it doesn't do anything with RACF variables, and it doesn't do anything with security labels. Okay, but aside from that, most of it's turned on. And I look at that and I go, well, because why, just because it's there is not a good reason. Okay, and that our documentation was insufficient to explain a bit how you ought to do it. On the other hand, also being able to say, yeah, well, you got ZOS people hanging around who know RACF, let them decide. And then it turns out they don't care. So that turned out to be an issue. All right, so what we're going to do here, I will tell you that it really is, you know, from my fevered mind, how this ought to be, but I'll show you also, I say down here, that trying to get this into the product, and good news, that has happened. So we'll talk about the details of that towards the end. First of all, what is wrong with when you deploy RACF? What are people doing? Well, the first thing you discover is that the system is trying to protect the spool. And you're getting all sorts of messages about something's not defined, or, you know, it's not that it doesn't work. It's that, oh, well, then when I created a new user, what did I get if I used the connector, or if I failed to create any of these profiles? Things are working, but I'm getting these RPIDIRCT messages out of the system. And I hate messages that really shouldn't be there. So it turns out that unless you're doing security labels, which means that you have multi-tenancy configurations, and you need to keep these people away from these people. Okay, I've got them hosting Coke and Pepsi, and they shouldn't be talking to each other. Well, then I care about these things. Okay, but in general, I haven't run into anybody who's doing that yet. Okay, so, well, I can't say I haven't run into anybody. I have run into one person, run over him, you know, but yeah, that is true. So in those cases, then you often do want, depending on how paranoid you are, depending on what your threat is, what you're trying to prevent, then actually you turn everything on. Okay? But you need to know what it's doing and why you turned it on. But spool files, restricted segments, and the vSwitch. There was a time, a decade ago, when I cared about the vSwitch being controlled by RACF. We used that to deal with VLAN IDs, and that seemed like a good idea at the time, when what we really needed to do, and what we eventually did, was allow you to put the VLAN ID on a NICDEF. And once that happened, I don't care. I configure this thing. I decide what your NIC is in, and that's authorization right there. The act of configuration is the act of authorization. Okay? Now, if you go from this idea that says, I've got a ZOS view of the world that says just because somebody configured it doesn't make it so. Okay? I have to have somebody who knows nothing about the technology, what I'm trying to implement, to decide whether it's okay or not. Right? The RACF administrators know a lot about administering RACF. They actually know very little, particularly depending on, you know, in my case where you get them from the ZOS side, you come and say, yeah, but you don't understand anything about VM. So I'm not protecting applications here. I'm protecting system level resources. This is not about, you know, not about applications. And so the whole model is very different. There are no group level controls. Everything today is really role-based access control. You can think that of groups. You're a member of a group, you're able to do something. You're not in the group, you can't. You know, most enterprises have that implemented all over the place in LDAP or whatever, and somebody says, I need access to some resource in the company. Somebody adds you to a group in LDAP and you're in. Okay, and when you are deprovisioned out of the system, you move on, all that stuff disappears. Okay, so we don't have much of that. Again, this is in the default configuration. There's nothing in there dealing with groups. No generic profiles. In the RACF world, we have discrete profiles and we have generic profiles, and generic profiles can really make your life easy. Okay, and I'll show a specific case where that applies. The default RACF database doesn't use KDF AES. Well, that's kind of dumb. Okay, you don't want DES level encryption in the database. You want AES encryption because you're not going to pass an audit if you have it set to DES. And there's no defined auditor. you kind of need an auditor set up in the first place because there are things that someone says, well, I need to turn on auditing. Then you need an auditor defined to the system. Okay, so you start off with one, then you can fine tune things later, but you first need to have an auditor. All right, and then it's easy to do all this stuff wrong in the first place, and you end up creating this massive amount of debris in RACF. And then you say, I'm going to fix it. I'm brave. And then you're like, oh, crap. Look at all the junk I have to clean up. Never mind. That's too much trouble. Have you looked in the basement? I'm not going to clean up the basement, because once I start, it's a never-ending process. Okay, so I look at this and say that the profile you don't create is the one you don't have to manage. It's like the password you don't have to change it. Right? But as soon as you start having passwords, you have to worry about these things. So just a refresher of what's going on, you have RPIDIRCT, which is the tool that comes with RACF, and that's the thing that takes the CP directory and it creates a file, the sysut1 file. And then your job is to go edit that file and go, now let me look through the hundreds of lines or thousands of lines that it generates and change it to what I like. If you're a RACF, dyed-in-the-wool RACF person, you'll go, there's an afternoon. But, if you're not, you're going, I have to go learn all this stuff. No, I'll just use it as it is. It'll be IBM's fault, whatever the result is, and I can live with that. Okay? So it creates this file, and then you modify it, and then you run a utility, RACF build data set, and it reads whatever's in that file and executes it and leaves you a log and tells you what it did. That's pretty straightforward. Now, you do that after you've enabled the RACF kernel. You can't load the RACF database until the system has RACF in it, which means that you're running in some sort of bizarre, this strained configuration when you first IPL and RACF is not populated with any data because you can't do it in advance. So it's the one time when things are a little weird, but your job at that point is to say, we're going to solve that problem right away. I'm prepared. I know what's going to happen next. That's a temporary thing. I'm not starting workload because I can't. Because you try to start things in the system and it's going, no, 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 no. Why? Because there's nothing in the database which is allowing access. So this new approach is, yes.
But if you do upgrade in place, you're bringing the RACF database forward.
If you're doing an upgrade in place, this doesn't come into play unless you want to start over. If you've decided, and this is legit, you can decide at any time that you don't like what you have, wipe out the database and start over. You just got, you got a plan that you're going to do that. When are you going to, I can't be bringing on virtual machines while I'm wiping out the RACF database. I have to have a moratorium on that. Good news is that you're not stuck with bad decisions. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to have a prologue, a prime, and an epilogue. Okay, these are just things I made up. Okay, RPIDIRCT doesn't create them, but I'm going to have them. So the prime sysut1 is a copy of what the file that RPIDIRCT created, and then I've sandwiched it between a prologue and an epilogue that I'm going to fill with stuff. And it's going to use groups and generic profiles, and this idea that log on by is the standard. Okay? This business about server virtual machines having a password, no. No, no, no. There are exactly two things that have passwords. People have passwords. Service accounts have passwords. Things you use for automation, right? That's it. Nothing else should have a password in the system because it doesn't need it. Who is logging on to it? FTP server. You log on to it. It's not a user, right? It's a daemon. And so it doesn't need a password. So the rule here is everything is log on by except for a few people. And again, what you don't have to, what you don't create, you don't have, doesn't expire, can't be revoked, So you're good. So most passwords, you change them to L by only. Right? You go in because user direct is is an input. So you create a copy of user direct, and you change the passwords in there to. And by the way, if you're reloading RACF after you start over, the passwords in the database are irrelevant. They're not retrievable. So you're starting over with brand new passwords anytime you go to reload the database. So you're processing the directory from scratch. And but you won't change the personal IDs of the admins. By the way, IBM VM1 is the first administrator. When we introduced that, I'm not exactly sure that concept didn't seem to come across. It was as though it was a maintenance ID. No. It's the thing that logs on to the maintenance IDs. It's the first human. Because we install the system, who's the first human? Well, not maint. Maint, again, is a maintenance ID. It's not a person. So to create the human, well, I think maybe we should have just asked you for the name of the first human, and we would just have renamed that ID to whatever you said at install time. Now that I think about it, that would have been a better ID. You've got these service accounts. CSM work is an example of a service account because it uses remote, it's doing remote functions, remote FTP, and it needs to have a user ID and password on the far side, and so that's one of the ones that keeps its password. If things already have auto only or no log as their password, that's okay. RPIDIRCT knows what to do when it sees those. One of the things to look at in your directory is if you have ACI group statements. ACI group statements are kind of cool. They came into being before RACF itself, before we really had RACF going, but it's kind of a way to have grouped resources as opposed to group users. But two things will happen when you have it in the directory. If you let it just roll through, it will change that so that the user ID is a member of that group. It will assign the RACF group with that name that doesn't already exist, and then it will assign the user to that group. That's fine. But if you go any further than that, what's going to happen is that the way he works today, when it goes to create the profiles for certain resource sources, for mini disks and what was the other one? Reader. Yeah, for VM Reader resources, it'll prefix it with the ACI group name. So if we were all members of the RACF group, then we could have all of our mini disks would all be named RACF.userid.vdev. And all of a sudden, RACF.** is a generic profile that references all the mini disks that belong to all the people who are in the RACF group. And now, what use is that? Okay, that's not very useful in general. There are some specific use cases you could convince me, but you really got to convince me. You have to buy me stuff too. So you need to remove this, but you need to remember it. Okay, because the way well, you don't need to remember it anymore. But this is something we've needed to remember because you take out the ACI group, but you got to go put users back in the correct group when you're all done. Okay, because I want them to be members of these groups, but I don't want all this weird naming of all the resources. And then the group management, depending on what's going on, I'm dealing with this prime or epilogue. Okay? In the prologue, so I'm going to turn on, one of the reasons I need the auditor role is because I need that to change certain settings. I have to be a RACF auditor. Excuse me. I need to turn on generics. By default, they're turned off. You know, you wouldn't want anybody accidentally using generics. Excuse me. We don't have to worry about this thing called no ad creator anymore. That's been the default for a few releases, so don't have to worry about that. That used to be, you would go and create a resource in RACF, and you're the person that created it, you were automatically on the access list. Well, I'm sorry. Administrators create things they're not necessarily allowed to get to them, right? That breaks a separation rule. So
Pain to clean up their ID later.
yes, and it's a pain to go, and you go, oh crap, but good news, it's the default. But if you've got an old database, it wasn't the default. So our setup list will show you what the value is, and you want no ad creator. Because I go around looking for those. When I'm looking through the access list, I go, that's odd. Who's this? Well, I don't know why that's there. Fail. All right. So we want passwords encrypted and password phrases, all encrypted with AES. We want a password minimum. You have to change it every 30 days. Right? I don't care what the value is. Whatever your policy says. All right. Because only admins have access to ZVM in the modern world. The idea of ZVM end users, that's not a thing. I mean, I might have some Linux admins who are logging on to Linux consoles, okay? And so I might have ZOS admins who are logging on to ZOS consoles. But again, it's kind of folks who are part of the system programming staff, right? Not end users, as much as I like to think of ZOS people as end users. Put them in their place. So I want to limit my password changes to once a day. I want to be sure to remember the last 30 passwords so that you can't reuse them. Even if you change it once a day, it'd take you a month to get around to reusing a password. Okay. People like to reuse passwords. It's not good. I want to revoke on the 4th attempt. Okay. If you get the wrong password. It is pretty funny when I'm watching movies and you're watching people are trying to hack into the password. And I'm like, wow, how's the system still allowing them to connect in? That ID should know. I'm sorry, you need to move on because this one's dead to you now. Nobody's going to log into it. And so I'm just busy, that would never happen with us. Tom Cruise would never get past it.
Does it support interval never?
Does it support interval never? There is an option that says that you don't have to change your password. And for service accounts, you might do that because you're going to say, well, for everybody else, they need to change it every 30 days. But maybe for you, no. Okay, for the service account, because that password is distributed around a lot of places. Now, we can't get lazy, right? You can't go, I'm never going to change it. Well, that's kind of can be an issue. Because what if the password leaks? We also add in information, so we're starting to use groups now. So it introduces groups. Now I use a naming convention that says if it starts with a $, it's a group. Why? Because I would never, ever create an ID that starts with a $. Why?
It's on the page, though.
I would never create one.
Oh, yes, this is true.
No, I'm just not going to do that. I don't really care what character you would choose, right? But the point is, I'm choosing something I wouldn't put in a user ID, and I would recognize $page, $school, which I don't actually use anyway when I have domain on the system, so I don't worry about those IDs. So I define it, and so I've got this one. So the one I pick here, that should say, VM proxy. So VM proxy. What it is I've decided I create a group, and anybody who's a member of VM proxy is able to use RACF for one thing. They're able to do RAC route calls. This means that they only have, but by the way, they only have what ZOS would call non-APF authorized access. They don't have access to privileged RACF functions. But it's a group. So anybody who's a member And likewise, VM proxy also is able to pretend to be anybody else's user ID. Okay? This is an example, when you see these asterisks, that's an example of a generic profile. When RACF goes looking for things, it tries to find the best fit, an exact match. Okay? And when you log into the FTP server and you tell it, you know, your ID and password, and then you go to do a put or a get or something like that, it changes its identity for the purposes of what you're trying to do, because it's going to discover, because that tells CP the rules, just pretend that I'm this person. Okay? And so when it goes to link to a disk, it's linking as you, not as FTP server. Okay? So, but that ability is something we don't give to just anybody, right? So, and I don't want to pick and choose. I can do this. I've got an asterisk here, which means it can be anybody in the system. Any user who logs in, who has a password, who can get into the FTP server, can then put and get files. If I want to change that, I will create a discrete profile, one with their ID in it, and then I'll say access none. They don't get to do it. Also, the FTP server can't be them. And if you can't be them, then their puts and gets aren't going to work. So I can't stop you from getting into the FTP server, but I can certainly stop you from transferring files. All right, so we will then set up system event controls. Now, what are system events? System events are kind of, this is the part where the ZOS people head explodes and go, the world is about, in the ZVM world, we have more things, we have resources that you don't even think about. So resources, access to a diagnose instruction which is, you know, we have a lot of privileged, you know, what privilege class do you have decides whether or not a particular diagnosis is in your namespace, okay? But sometimes we want to have additional controls implemented by RACF, because maybe this is again a case of a Coke and a Pepsi thing, and you're about to do something that is kind of going to mix Coke and Pepsi, and that tastes horrible. Okay, so it's not going to. The system would disallow that, but that requires then that there be a hook in there for RACF to get control. So certain diagnose instructions, certain CP commands, and what we call system events. Example of a system event is when a virtual machine has a virtual NIC and it wants to put the NIC into sniffer mode, promiscuous mode. That's something that RACF can control and decide, because it turns out you are trying to sniff traffic, you are a Pepsi user, and you manage to get access to a Coke virtual VLAN, Coke VLAN, and you try to turn on sniffing. Can't happen. And we don't allow that to, even though you have the power to do it from CP's point of view, RACF is going no. If we will see that we have commands that exist in multiple privilege classes. Transfer is a good example. And an end user, a class G user, can use the transfer command for all their own spool files. Okay? A class D user has the same transfer command, but if you notice, the syntax changes slightly, and they can specify anybody's spool files. So those are two different aspects, two different instances, two different flavors of the same command. RACF will identify them separately. I'll see a resource out there, and its name is transfer.g and transfer.d. Okay, and so I need to be aware of that. So these events have several states. It can be controlled, not controlled, or audited. So there's this rule so this goes when you deploy RACF by default. What do you get? I will protect everything that I can, and I will audit nothing. Okay? I almost wish the other way around. But by the way, you can audit an awful lot of stuff that you really shouldn't. Who would want to audit diagnose 8?
Apparently all my systems.
Okay? The system does those constantly, right? And of course, it might be interesting to pick on an individual user and say, I'm curious to what you're doing, but I'd really have to have a reason to dig, right? It's like, I don't worry about my stuff in the cloud. Why? Who the hell knows who I am? You know, you got to find me first. You have to decide that I'm interesting. Then I'll go look. Okay, so not all events can be controlled. A very small subset of CP commands, what are we up to, 11 or 12, that can actually be controlled by RACF. You know, the one I like to pick on a lot is the store host command. That lets you change CP's memory, not the virtual machine. Normally, that just takes Class C privilege. Well, there are a lot of people who like to have Class C privilege, but I'm like, and you should have it. You're the system programmer. But, you know, you shouldn't have the ability to change hypervisor memory. Okay, that, first of all, that's really dangerous. And two, what are you doing that for? And so RACF actually can control, you may have Class C, but you don't have privilege to issue the store host command. Unless you've opened a ticket, you know, and you've said, by the way, I've got a case open, here's its number, and IBM has said you need to issue the store host command. I have proof I'm supposed to do it. Otherwise, what the heck are you doing? Right? So turn it off, plus it's a little safety thing. All right, so this is handled in VM, and this is a part that ZOS RACF people will not recognize, is the idea that we created an infrastructure that allows CP to not call RACF in the first place. Because, now remember, when all of this was invented, late 70s to early 80s, machines were slow, DASD was slower. Okay, and the last thing we wanted was to be constantly making trips across, using IUCV connections, talking to, paging in RACF, remember also small memory footprints back in the day, and creating calls to RACF that we didn't actually need to do. I don't want to go to RACF, get a defer from him that says, I don't know, that's not turned on, I'm not protecting that. He defers back, CP says, well, then I'll do what I was going to do anyway. Oh, I wish I hadn't called you in the first place. VMX event profiles are designed to control whether or not CP calls RACF for these events, these CP level events. And if he does so, is he calling it to be controlled or calling it just for auditing purposes? Okay? And so I create a VMX event profile, in this case events 1. Why did I choose events 1? Because that's the one that's in the books. Okay, I don't need a better reason. It's just, that's the one. And then I start adding things to it, and I decide, what am I going to control? What am I not going to control? Now I could just put in the things that I want to control, and then the others will get turned on by default. No. I'm going to give the complete list, and I'm going to say what I'm controlling, what I'm not controlling. And I figured out this list with malice aforethought. And mostly it looked like, and so what I've got in here is a set of events that say, first of all, APPC password validation. I want RACF to handle that. I don't understand why that's an option. Okay, but it is. So that should be turned on. And logon, you'll notice, is not on the list. Logon is always controlled. If you said xautolog with a password on it, that would also be always controlled. Nobody who does that. This idea that I'm going to pretend to be other people, that VM batch thing I talked about, that's diagnose D4. And then, of course, the link command, and there's the control for the Class C store command, that's store host. Okay? Everything else I've turned off. I don't care about any of this other stuff. There's vSwitches are the couple. The for command, I've got the for command for Class G users. The for command for Class C users, I'm not controlling. Because I gave you Class C. I don't know what else, how much more I can trust you. Except to give you store host control. Okay? So I'm not going to worry about getting in your way. And I'm not going to control diagnose 88 It's an option in the directory. I don't, again, when you kept separation of duties, when you had RACF, I'm sorry, RACF has to say okay, and then I had my system programmers who I obviously don't trust, okay, then that made some sense, having the two, but we're past that. Now we are in the provisioning, we're in the cloud world, and what other platform does it stop? The places where the process stops are the approvals in the first place to create virtual servers. If you have if a stop sign goes up, it's because, I'm sorry, you said you wanted to create a large one, but you didn't write the proper size check. Okay? You didn't click the box that says, we may deduct from your account. You know, whatever. And so it stops before you ever create it in the first place. But once it gets to the point where you're creating a virtual server, you know what privileges it needs. You know what access rights are needed to make it run. I don't need somebody else telling me, as the system programmer, as the person who's deploying virtual machines, you don't want to go to ICIC, click, create, and it goes to start, and it won't start. Why? Because nobody created the RACF definitions for the user. And somebody says, RACF admin comes along and says, oh, what should I create? Well, here, I've written it down for you. Oh, okay, I'll just do exactly what you told me. In which case, what does the value add? Okay? So we're in a world where if we're going to have a conversation about dual control, okay, or separation of duties, we need to stop and have that conversation because that needs to disappear. Okay? So I turned off control for everything else. Yes?
Why are you turning on control for 4.g?
I turned that on for 4.g because if you have, it turns out that if you're running RACF and you have logon by privileges to a user ID, you can issue the CP4 command to that user ID. I'm not going to make you log on to it just to issue a command over there. Okay? And so if you're not running RACF, that doesn't apply. CP will not do that on its own. That's specifically in the realm of the ESM. So that's why we did that.
They don't need a profile to give them permits. They just, by virtue of being sec user, you go to the start.
Nothing related to sec user, but you have to have permission to the logon by profile.
Yeah.
So I create all of this, and at the end I'm doing this set event refresh thing, which puts all of that into effect. All right, and then I'm going to go into the prime sysut1 file with all my users. I've got all those passwords. This is the part where I'm going to delete them or change them, and noting that personal IDs, I have to know who they are. So personal IDs will not be able to. What am I going to say? Your personal ID as a system programmer, you would be able to show up, or whatever the defined ID is. Some sites have 2 IDs per person, sort of your personal ID, and then your I'm doing business ID, right? And the doing business ID has logon by authority to basically every virtual machine in the system except other administrators. Okay? They're not allowed to log on to it. Why? Because they don't belong to you. But we can all log on by to TCP/IP if we need to. All right, we're not going to revoke IBM user, but we will remove its password. IBM user is the one user that's allowed to do things if you need to reinitialize the RACF database. Okay, so I like to have it there. It's there to it's a nice place if I need to repair something, but it's going to be logon by. I don't need to revoke it. Revoking it is such a 1980s thing. Okay. I've got that VM admin group, and the VM admin group has access to the logon by profile, the generic profile, which means if I connect your ID to the $VM admin group, you can log on by to everybody. I don't have to do permits for everybody, which is how the system by default deploys itself. I'd have to go permit you to all that, or create a group and do the permits to all of these users. But having the generic profile makes life a lot simpler. RACF variables, Linux admin. I did this to show that if you create, when you start deploying Linux or anything else, having a naming convention for your user IDs makes life a lot easier. As opposed to, I want to be able to tell that, first of all, it's a Linux ID. And then can I tell that it's not only Linux, but it's Oracle, or it's DB2, or it's WebSphere, whatever. And the point being is that, notice in this case, I have a surrogate profile. This is controls log by, and it's a generic, but it says LNX asterisk. So any ID that starts with LNX, it would find this profile before it finds the asterisk asterisk. Okay? So I could have a set of Linux admins and say, you can log on to any Linux ID that gets created. Okay? I don't have to do anything special for it. It'll just happen. If you don't happen to have names that follow a pattern, well, we do have a way out. Nobody wants to look at RACF variables, the RACF vars class. But if you sit and get in a quiet room, turn off the music, get the cat out, and say, I'm going to sit down and study this, all of a sudden you go, cool. Okay? So, whereas generic profiles work when you have a pattern, RACF variables let you create variable names and then add things to the variable name. And these names that I add don't have to have a pattern. They're just random IDs. Okay? And I will refer to this logonby.ampersand Linux group. And again, Linux admin has access. So anything that got added to this profile, you would have logonby access to. So you don't have to have the pattern there. It's nice. It makes life simpler, only so you don't have to bother with RACF vars.
To clarify, so with the add group Linux admin, with the logon by LNX asterisk, would that supersede the system programmer group from being able to log on by?
Correct. So if the system programmer group was supposed to be able to also log on by to the Linux guest, though that would typically, in the world I've encountered, that would not be permitted. The system programmer has no business logging onto the virtual console of the Linux guest unless it's a Linux guest that belongs to this, is in system support, or you are the Linux admin. Okay? But otherwise, you stay out of that. But yeah, you would have to also, I could have permitted a $Linux ADM and also $VMN, if that's what I want. All right, so you would go through, so that prime sysut1 file, the thing that RPIDIRCT created, I got to go through and delete all the logon by profiles except those associated with people and with service accounts. You can see already that this is getting to be tedious, right? You don't say, I think that I'll take an hour and enable RACF, okay? You first have to spend hours figuring out, well, what do I want it to be when I'm done? Because I got to change, I know I'm going to start, but I got to get to an end point. But if you're just kind of guessing, just stop guessing. It's not good. And then I would add this for each personal ID, making sure that they had their own discrete profile, and it's discrete because it's fully specified, no asterisks, and it has their ID in it. Okay? And they have to have access to their own, or else they can't log on. Weird rule, but there was a time when we had this thing called shared IDs. We call it, I don't know. I think it was the case where you had a manager and secretaries. And the secretary would log on and do things, literally log on and do things. Okay? And of course, you wouldn't let your manager log to their own ID. That would be dumb. Because they don't know what they're doing. I've never really understood this concept, but there it is. Okay. Prof. Well, yeah, well, that's when it was originally when I saw it being done. And that's what I mean about, you don't want the managers managing their own calendars, for heaven's sake. You print it out and give it to them every day. But any ID without that profile, if RACF doesn't find that one, he'll start looking for the generics. And if he finds one, we're good. And this asterisk matches anything else in the system. If it doesn't find a better one, it'll use this one. And then I start deleting more and more stuff. All the things that it created, delete, 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 delete. Because I'm not controlling, I'm changing the VM batch stuff to use a generic profile. So I don't want all the discrete profiles that are out there. Because what's happened is RPIDIRCT has created discrete profiles, billions of them. And you're like, I'm not doing anything. Get rid of them. Because they take up space. Don't want them. You know, I'm not doing the reader stuff. I'm not controlling RSTS, what nodes you're allowed to send stuff to. I'm not doing it. And I'm not doing vSwitch, and if I want to restrict the NSSs and DCSSs, the CP restrictions are good enough. Okay, I don't need to do it in RACF. And VM dev, I'm not going to control, I've chosen not to control the attach command because the only people who can issue the attach command are the people who I gave the appropriate privilege to, in which case I want them to do it. Now, if I don't trust them to attach the right thing, I would turn this on because this lets me control who can attach what to where. You know, somebody says, I've got Class A privileges or B privileges, I can attach the device, but you don't have permission to it. No. Okay. And I will also then go in here, and this is where I put those groups back in that I made note of earlier, put those in there. And then I start in the epilogue, then I finally start, I start cleaning things up, make DIRMate special. Why? Because it says in the book, DIRMate needs to be special if you're going to use the connector. So I go ahead and do it. Whoever had linked no pass, I'm going and making them operations authority, so that they still have that same privilege. If I've got any RACF administrators, make them administrators. Now's the time. There's no point in waiting. And then if you've got users, and I like this when I've gone to client sites, and they say, you don't want to audit things, give me the RO audit attribute. It means I can issue things like, I can issue privilege RACF commands to see things, but I can't change things. I like that. That's a nice way to, particularly if you want to bring somebody on board to RACF, you're going, here, you can look at things, and let's make sure you understand what you're looking at before we actually allow you to touch. And then finally, you run, you have that prologue, prime, and epilogue, you run the RPI build dataset 3 times. I tell you 3 times. So, and it's not done until it gets through the epilogue. And you examine, it creates a report, you look at it. It's good.
On the last chart, do you have to initialize it for like the 0? Or it assumes there's no...
When it starts, this assumes that it's 0. If it's not 0, there are utilities that you run to reset and destroy the data. You're going to do ICK DSF inits, and you're going to run RPI. I can't remember. Anyway, all in the book. It is actually kind of nice when you start is to take a snapshot of your RACF database before you begin and go, I'm just keeping that. That's an uninitialized RACF database right there. And if I ever need another one, just flash copy it over or DDR it over, and you're back to square one. And the thing that's always in a database, the thing that's hard-coded in there is things like IBM user. You can't delete IBM user out of the database. You won't do it. It's permanent. And then if you're running config RC data DVH and DIRMate, where you've got the connector enabled, you've got things that need to match. I've said I want the owner, in this case, the sample I pulled, said that, when it's creating VM reader profiles, I wanted it to make $VM admin the owner. This whole idea that end users own their own profiles, that's how it creates them by default. That's something you may decide you don't want to do. I haven't done that from a project perspective, But that's one going, I'm sorry, virtual machines are not in charge of their own destiny. That's not how it works in the rest of the world. You don't get to decide who gets access to your 191 disk. I decide who gets access, because I don't know why you're doing that. Why are you sharing it? Now, the deal is that when you create new personal IDs, because the RACF connector only knows how to do one thing. And if you need to do something different, you need to go change it. Okay, so now by default, it's going to say, hey, I'm not creating log-on by profiles. They'll be part of he'll be covered by the generic. Oh, I just added a new VM admin. I need to go manually create their log-on by profile to prevent that. So, so the modified suit sounds good, but you really want to go through this exercise of figuring out how do I actually want my system to look and how am I going to manage it. Okay? So the system is more secure. You can actually explain what you're looking at because it makes sense. So in May, we delivered in RACF 7.4.3, okay, or service level 0300, an enhancement to RPIDIRCT. The cool thing is that it does what we've talked about. Okay, so
You could have let off with that.
what's that?
You could have let off with that.
No, I did actually. I said, well, because at the beginning it said we're looking at integrating this into the product. So I said it's been done.
Would have made a much shorter presentation.
Yeah, what would I want that for? But again, to understand why. Important things to understand why you would care and why you might decide, I think I'm going to reinitialize my database. I want the new way. But there's always been an RPIDIRCT control file that it reads. Have to do with POSIX group names. But in there now are new keywords. And the one that we ship has a default group, so you can override that. RPIDIRCT actually asks you what the default group is if you run it in its old school mode. It says, what do you want the default? Well, I don't need you to prompt me for these things. I can put them in a file. Who are the VM administrators? So I can just list them here. And then what is the name of my VMX event profile? Events one. I'm showing you, these are the default values that are in there. Oh, I left off. Did I leave off one? I did leave off one. There's one called user_VM. That's where you put the other IDs that aren't administrators, but they need passwords. They won't have passwords. Those would be like service IDs. People who aren't going to be in the $VM admin group, but they still need discrete profiles. So they're kind of like end users. It'll create these $VM admin, $rack route, $VSM proxy. We talked about $VM admin. Rack route is there so that you can just connect users to rack route if you want. And VM proxy is again VM serve. It adds VMNFS that needs to be removed in 7.5. But there's a bug. It doesn't add CSM serve. I would add CSM serve to
Who
that.
needs CSM?
Huh? Well, yes.
So who needs it in?
If you're using CSM. Again, by default, it has a protect keyword. You can repeat that as many times. The file, as we ship it, actually is fully commented. It has the syntax of all the statements in there, so you don't have to go to the book. Actually, go to the book. I can't find it in the book, but it's in the file, the syntax. But starting with something reasonable. So no spool file or vSwitch protections by default. 30 days history, 12 days. These are what's in there. Okay. So 3 invalid password attempts again once a day. So these are the default values. Saying, well, now you can at least see them and say, I should think about what they ought to be. It's sometimes just seeing it makes you think about it. If you don't know it's there, why would you give it any thought? So that should significantly, I'm not going to say you still don't go in and make a change, but now you're starting from a much better starting point. Okay, something that is defensible, something you say, well, Alan says it's okay, so it must be all right. That'll get you along. Particularly if I'm doing the auditing, it works. If you want to do it the old way, we provide a no profile option in RPIDIRCT. So by default, it's going to switch to the new way, because that's what I want people to use who've never used RACF before. But if you say, I want to compare this to what it used to do, you can invoke RPIDIRCT with no profile option, and it'll just, crank out the same stuff it's always done. There's some discussion of it in the RACF Security Administrator's Guide for more information. All right. So good news. Now you have better understanding. That's a lot of stuff, by the way, for an hour. But understanding that there's a reason and a rhyme to how RACF configuration ought to be, and it is an act of being considered, a considered set of options, not just, I think I'll take the defaults. Usually when you go, I think I'll take the defaults and you don't even know what they are, that can get you in a lot of trouble. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, no.
Are we ever going to get dial protection?
What's that?
Are we ever going to get dial protection?
Are you ever going to get dial protection? You'll have to ask the person who's actually in charge of security, who's sitting back there.
Can we protect dial, please?
Yeah. Yeah.
Stop recording first.
Clayton has a dial mod, so you authenticate when you dial, and then it decides what. So people can't just come up and dial your second level.
Right, it's multi-tenant. You can't mix Coke and Pepsi.
Right. So I have to know who you are before I can decide whether or not you can get in.
Right.
It's a perfectly reasonable thing. IBM itself has had that mod internally for ages, and
I would like to see dial Y.
yes, it's all part of the part and parcel of the same thing. All right. Anything else? All right. Thank you very much.